in China, anthropology of religion, and Islam in Asian context. So, you might say it could be sort of far removed from what we shall be discussing, and yet there are many intersecting points of discussion, commonalities, and much that provoked my interest in reading some of the presentations and looking at your biographies. My involvement, however, when it comes to, let me confess right at the start, when it comes to preparation for this particular forum, has been perhaps more peripheral. But despite my peripheral role in all of that, I've had plenty of opportunities to admire the extraordinary work and the effort, the patience, the bloody determination that's gone into bringing about this strategic forum. And that optimism, at times in the face of considerable obstacles that there were. And many have participated and contributed to this forum, and I have to thank Elmore Yap, of course, who's been important to us. But central, I think, to the success of this has been the partnership. Sabina Din, CEO, founder of Din Consultants, and I'll make a reference to you in a moment, and Dr. Pinjin Tong, also known as PJ, who is who's really heading the Symposium organizing committee. But Sabina, I think PJ would agree that you have really been the guiding spirit with all. Without you, it just would not have happened. And I think, in a way, to me, you really exemplify what really the entrepreneurial spirit is all about. Quite extraordinary. So, these words of appreciation necessary, and I hope it fulfills your expectations. This is certainly a very inspiring, but also very ambitious program which has been set for this forum. And the ambition was set out right at the start, if you look at the brochure, because it talks about gender equality, one of the most sort of central, crucial issues facing Southeast Asia, at the same time as there are enduring barriers to women's aspirations. And it is really the exploration of obstacle barriers, but also opportunities, because we are not just about victim narratives here, and women no longer in the position of confronting challenges. It's really also about what kind of opportunities now offering themselves that would facilitate the particular goals that women are setting themselves. And this is to be brought about, this what is hoped for, a constructive plan of action, the outcome of this forum, through a collaboration, a collaborative sort of effort of leaders here invited to this forum, leaders from various spheres of society, sectors of society, business, academia, civil society, organizations. And this is really, it is also a fundamental premise that you need the critical mass of women to bring about fundamental change, to bring about concrete and constructive results. So for that purpose, there have been huge attention to pay to how this is being organized in terms of presentation, but rapporteurs, feedback, reviews, and concluding sessions where all these issues, findings are brought together to bring about something else, to build on that. So we don't disperse, it's not a one-off opportunity, something needs to come out of that. So this is hugely, wonderfully inspirational. What are the primary themes? We are going to start with gender and economic development right at the heart, the issues the gendered nature of development. In Southeast Asia context, I'll come back to that in a moment, advancing women in innovation technology, financial inclusion empowerment, entrepreneurship growth, and of course, leadership in all of that, women in leadership. So these are going to be really exciting events. Opportunities that provide rich learning opportunities for us. So, but whilst we are going to focus, it seems to be on certain specific issues, certain specific areas of inquiry involving entrepreneurship specifically, relationship with economic development, issues of women equality. But I think these forum discussions will also make wider points of importance in terms of wider issues of social gender transformation. To quote here from Karen Marie Mocato, who's sort of been looking, analyzing women's participation, social development in Asian context, involving women, she says, at all levels of development processes, thinking, planning, and implementation, makes a significant difference to the world. To bring women to the center stage, however, requires profound changes in the socialization process that reproduces gender relations as well as dismantling centuries-old structures of thought and practice. And these centuries-old structures of thought and practice are very situated in what we call the Southeast Asia context. And that is the first, one of the 2-3 points I want to make very briefly. Southeast Asia. I think that is where we are going to face a certain challenge. Southeast Asia is not a simple, homogeneous construct. And we have to beware of homogenization of that as we talk across, as we use particular kind of terminologies that come out of economic development, out of entrepreneurship. And I think the nuances the presentations will bring to that, bring that out as well. Southeast Asia is actually a much contested geopolitical construct, very much unlike the Southeast Asia context which I come from, where there is a degree of commonalities, you could argue, in terms of language, ethnicity, and very much the enduring legacy of Neo-Confucian patriarchal culture. Southeast Asia is influenced by the ancient culture, civilization of India, of China. It's a region that's marked by a huge diversity of language, of religion, race, ethnicity, colonial history, in terms of population size, wealth, poverty, and so on. And so compared to East Asia kinship system, Southeast Asia, very bilateral kinship, the tradition of matrilocal residency with this enduring legacy, and so on, provided in certain ways you could argue for greater security women within the domestic sphere, yet which never properly, comprehensively translated into socio-political statuses or participation in decision-making processes. The same caveat that I think applies to the construct of Southeast Asia, and I think we all have to be aware of that, it seems to me also applies to the construct of entrepreneurship. Because women entrepreneurs are not a cohesive group, sort of self-identifying actors or identifiable actors. And yet, gender as an analytical category, as an indicator of change, of continuity, of even conservatism, or of a change for innovation, in that sense, does allow, I think, for the exploration of a great many shared features. That is, situating gender, as our presenters will be doing, at the intersection of market, the state, education, information and communication technology, patriarchy, entrepreneurship, enables a closer examination of what is both a symbiotic but also very problematic relationship, linkage between economic development, empowerment, and equality. I think that's going to be very much explored here. To quote finally from Philippe Debrou, as in other parts of the world, the development of female entrepreneurship induces a complex debate on the place of women in society as economic agents, but also as key members of their families, their communities, and their countries. Just recently, it was Aung San Suu Kyi, new leader of Myanmar, Burma, closely associated with the university, also the patron of my research center, as it happens, who, when she was referring to the problematic of economic development as just, as fair and ethical, and all the difficulties attendant upon that, made the core concept of her, when she talked about women economic development, the core concept that of economic dignity. Economic dignity. Dignity as a condition, she said, of her nation's mark of prosperity, as prosperity that was holistic, all-embracing. A dignity that, she said, that requires resources, opportunities, choices, recognition in all spheres of life. And I think this demand for dignity is really also at the heart, the core of this particular forum. So thank you very much for the very few words of welcome, and we will straight away launch into our first panel. Gendered economic development in Southeast Asia, which I will be chairing now. And to give you very, very briefly background to our first speaker, you have, most of you will have the brochure, so you have opportunity to read up on biography. And I will also only make very brief references to that. The format is as follows, that our three presenters will give their papers in the first place, and that will then be followed by questions and answers and a brief review and resume at the end of our session. And the gendered nature of economic development really is at the heart of what we are discussing. And we're going to hear today about the Malaysian model, how policies influence the empowerment of women, including the contradictions attendant upon that. We're going to hear about women's right equality within regional economic policies, and the gendered nature of access to fintech. Finance, it's a term I only recently became familiar with. Women's access to the obstacles attending upon gender full participation in these exciting, enormously important, significant developments in finance technologies. Our first speaker is Professor Janita Anias, Associate Professor of Political Economy, International Political Economy at the University of Warwick, published widely. journals, International Political Sociology, Economy and Society, Third World Quarterly, Review of International Economy, International Feminist, Journal of Politics, Pacific Review. And many of you know her as the author of Fashioning Inequality, Multinational Firm, and Gender Employment in a Globalizing World, was published in 2004, co-edited The Global Political Economy of the Household in Asia, as well as the textbook International Relations, the Basics. And there's a forthcoming publication, The Everyday Political Economy of Southeast Asia, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. And Jonita's research explores the way in which gender relations and identities operate and are reproduced within a range of political economic settings. Jonita, if I may invite you to the microphone. Do you have? You have no power.
I have no power.
So wonderful. We'll be able to listen to you. We're much looking forward to your.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for putting together this exciting programme of events around women's empowerment and leadership in Southeast Asia. And also, I suppose it's really rather daunting to be the first person to speak, because at this point you never quite know how the conversation is going to go, whether what I'm going to say will be of relevance or not to the conversation as it evolves over the course of the conference. Thank you for your very generous introduction. I'm a political economist based at Warwick University in the Department of Politics and International Studies, and I've been researching and writing on gender issues in Southeast Asia for some time, and I've had a number of different projects, many of which have been focused on Malaysia, which have looked at a range of issues, including things such as women's factory employment, women's employment as domestic workers, women's movements, and also gender policy making in Malaysia. And I'm actually just starting a new project, which I've not done any field work for yet at all. I've simply received a grant, and it's a project that's about to start with my colleague Lena Rethel here, which is looking at issues around women's empowerment in the Jakarta slums and in the context of slum resettlement programs. So I'll talk a tiny bit about that project, but mainly the talk today is going to be focused on the work that I've done in Malaysia. So one of the things that I want to kind of emphasise in my comments today is that I think it's important to note from the outset that one of the issues that I've been really interested and kind of runs throughout all of my research is how the issue of women's empowerment is something that is very differentially experienced by different groups of women. So I would very much pick up on the point made in Maria's comments earlier about, let's not have a kind of homogenising approach to issues around women and development, women's empowerment and women's leadership when we're talking about Southeast Asia, or indeed anywhere in the world. We simply can't think about women as a single simple category of people and assume that gender empowerment is something that can be achieved through straightforward, one-off, one-size-fits-all policy interventions. And my research on Malaysia has sought to look at this issue in some depth. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on and off for some time now, which looks at the gender politics of Malaysia's emphasis on economic competitiveness in economic planning and policy making. And one thing that I've been very interested in is the way in which government policy agendas and planning strategies in Malaysia, but also I think there are parallels with many other states around the world in relation to this. And they've come to increasingly frame women and women's households as a source of economic competitiveness and dynamic growth. And in the Malaysian context, there are very real fears that the country is facing some kind of middle income trap. and the issue of women's low labour force, relatively low labour force participation rate, it's only low by kind of regional standards, is frequently identified in government planning documents as one of the many sources of the country's economic problems. The argument proceeds that by increasing women's labour force participation, we can harness the skills and talents of, not exclusively, but in particular, educated middle-class women who tend to drop out of the labour force on marriage. Now, of course, we know that this is a statistical trend which many scholars have problematised. So I would note, for example, the work of Anya Frank, who's pointed out in her research on the career and life trajectories of Penang factory workers that women may not actually drop out of the labour market at all. It may simply be the case that they move into more informal forms of employment after getting married and having children that simply don't show up in the statistics. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the kind of the contradictions that stem from the implementation of policies aimed at increasing women's labour force participation. Implementing these policies has been extremely difficult in a society in which, like many other parts of the world, the work of raising children is seen primarily as women's work. Government policies have talked a lot about increasing the availability of childcare for working mothers, and there has been some successes, but the results remain rather mixed. There does appear to have been some success over the last 5 years in increasing women's labour force participation rate from around about, I think, 42% to just over 50% today. And that compares to a male labour force participation rate of around about 80%. But whether or not this increase in women's labour force participation rate is a direct result of government policy making, I think that's yet to be ascertained. Now, it's notable that one of the rare areas of policy success in issues around gender policy making has been the issue of women's representation on corporate boards. And that is an issue that I think we can point to as an area in which there has been a considerable movement forward on the agenda, and it can be seen as a policy success. Whereas issues like, for example, government commitments around kind of provision of childcare and those kinds of things, the picture's much more mixed. But the issue of women's representation on corporate boards does, for all intents and purposes, seem to appear as something of a success story. What's also interesting about the issue of women's representation on corporate boards is that it's an issue that's had widespread support across government, sectors of the corporate world, and also civil society groups. So the establishment of a 30% target is often referred to as a quota, but it's not a quota, on publicly listed Malaysian companies was announced in 2011 by the then head of the Securities Commission of Malaysia, Zarina Anwar. And I'll just have a drink before my throat gives up. Now, I don't want to criticise this policy per se, because I think that it is an important success story, and it does, and it's something that, of course, is an important thing, and I think most people here would support the issue of the increasing representation of women on corporate boards. But I think that we also need to be attentive to the fact that across the globe, the issue of women's representation on corporate boards is very much an elite women's agenda. We cannot simply assume that the interests of women sitting on corporate boards are going to be somehow always in sync with the interests of all female employees within that organisation or of women in society more generally. So, for me, one of the problems is that in a lot of Malaysian government planning and policy documents, the 10th and 11th Malaysia plans, for example, a great deal of emphasis is placed on this success story. In some ways, rightly so, because it is a success story, but in other respects, I find it problematic the way in which the issue has been mobilised as indicative of the way in which the government is seeking to address gender inequalities and women's empowerment issues more generally. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about a very small segment of women who actually benefit from being able to serve on corporate boards. So, but what's very interesting is that, well, many women's organisations in Malaysia have been broadly supportive of this policy, and I think we can understand that in a sense because they see this issue more in terms of it being a gender equality success story in an increasingly socially conservative country. So, you know, any movement forward on gender issues is seen as a good thing. But at the same time, the issue of women's representation on corporate boards was not something that the women's movement in Malaysia actively lobbied and pushed for in the same way that they've pushed for other issues and campaigned around issues such as increasing Islamicisation of state and society, domestic violence issues, or issues around feminisation of low-paid work, and a range of other women's human rights issues. The corporate boards issue is not really at the centre of their agenda, and in fact, the civil society actors that most doggedly pursued this agenda tends to be organisations such as shareholder groups and business associations that formed alliances with key senior, usually female bureaucrats within the state. And the Malaysian women's movement was very much marginal to this debate and these discussions and the eventual emergence of this particular policy agenda. So that was all I was really going to say about the issue of women on corporate boards. I mean, basically my point there is that, you know, we shouldn't see this as a straightforward women's empowerment agenda that all women benefit from. That actually it's a very particular group of women that benefit from this, and we shouldn't overstate the kind of broader gender equality claims that stem from the issue of women's representation on corporate boards. There's a lot more to women's equality and women's empowerment than this small issue. Issues, how much more time do I have?
Another 5
Excuse
minutes?
Okay. 6 minutes.
6 minutes. You're the timekeeper?
So I'll just wait.
Thank you.
So issues of women's empowerment also tend to be invoked in discussions of female entrepreneurship, and I know that's a big theme of the conference, of these sessions today. It's not something I've done a great deal of work on, but I thought it might be something that would be worth addressing, at least in passing. And the issue of women's entrepreneurship is something that's continually invoked in terms of the role that female entrepreneurs can play in poverty alleviation and also potentially economic growth more generally. And we see this emphasis in Asian Development Bank or World Bank documents on gender and development, for example. And we also see it coming through in Malaysian planning and policy documents as well. But when we think about women's empowerment, an important concern that I have is the way in which empowerment is often straightforwardly instrumentalised. The argument is made that improvements in women's role and position in society are worth thinking about because of the economic benefits, rather than approaches that enable us to focus on what women might actually want and what they see as the purpose of economic development and entrepreneurship for their own lives. So this concern is something that Lena and I have made quite central to the project that we will be starting, looking at women in Jakarta slums. And we're very keen to, in that project, look at how women themselves have sought to challenge and influence some slum resettlement practices and the ways in which they try to deal with a very unfortunate situation in ways that will enhance their own empowerment. So we're keen, not just to kind of bring in women's voices into this research, but also to think through issues such as and this does connect to the discussion of entrepreneurship, to think about issues such as, if you're running a business from home, what does it mean to be resettled? How can that be, how can you continue to maintain your livelihood in these kinds of situations? We're also looking at issues around finance and also issues around safe spaces for women as well. So if anyone here has been doing research on slum resettlement or looking at women's empowerment issues kind of from the grassroots up, then we'd be very interested to talk to you. I would also say, coming back to the theme I started with about looking at how empowerment is experienced differentially by different groups of women, one of the issues that I've been looking at for several years now has been the issue of migrant domestic worker employment. And I think, you know, the fact is that the empowerment of certain groups of women, particularly middle-class women, often has knock-on effects, particularly in the context of states where we're talking about there being very minimal welfare state provisioning, and middle-class women are incredibly dependent on domestic workers coming from other parts of the world to perform domestic duties and look after children. So we need to always be conscious of the way in which the empowerment of one particular group of women may have knock-on consequences for other groups of women as well. Now, I'm not just going to suggest to you that migrant domestic workers are always victims, are always locked in awful situations, but I think we also need to recognise the very adverse conditions upon which poor rural women enter these circuits of migration. So, I will conclude there. I think one of the concerns that I'd like to raise is that I think that when we are talking about issues around women's leadership and women's empowerment, we constantly need to pay attention to the very different ways in which women experience those issues, and the women who are not leaders as well. So I think if we're going to be thinking about developing a constructive plan of action out of the discussions at this conference, then I would place this issue about thinking about how different groups of women, not just different groups of women within society, but also when we're looking across societies as well, when we're looking at issues around those who are excluded from citizenship rights because of their migration status or their refugee status as well. So these are all issues that need to kind of flow into thinking about, you know, what this plan of action might look like. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent, Anita, because in a way you immediately suggested some of the complexity that needs to attend our conversation, and the nuances you bring into that when we speak of empowerment, you know, gender equality, entitlement, let's be context specific. Let's understand what kind of alternative conceptions there might be. And me, the anthropologist, immediately thinks, of course, of the fact of religion, Islamization, and conservatism. And I think that's something perhaps we could bring out in our discussion. And that is something now that Professor Rashida Amil, I think, will also be treating her presentation of women's rights and equalities within that regional context and within regional economic policies. So it builds wonderfully well, I think, on that presentation that we've just had. Now, very briefly, Professor Ramli is a principal fellow, professor of political science, director at the Institute of Malaysian International Studies, University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, areas of specialization, political development, gender politics, human security, currently researching governance of South China Sea, implications on ASEAN, and promoting social inclusion through public policy. So, Rashida, if I can ask you to the microphone to continue, I think, what's going to turn out a very, very promising series of discussions here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the introduction, and thank you very much to the organizer for having APWLD here. Actually, I am representing the Asia Pacific Forum for Women, Law and Development. This organization is an organization which has existed for about almost 30 years, and we are actually based in Chiang Mai. And the person who should be presenting today is actually the coordinator, Dr. Kate Lappin, but there was some last minute situation. So since I'm also presenting in a panel later on in the afternoon under AEC, so I'm very happy to actually step in.
You're giving value in that.
I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Because this is the issue is also very close to my heart in terms of the work. So this slide was prepared by Kate, but I'll do my best to present it. Okay, and if I do this, we should be fine. Okay. As an overview, since we only have 15 minutes, and we are actually moving up to the regional level, because the regional level has definitely an impact. It was very good to listen to the story of Malaysia, and I think we can add up certain things to Malaysia. But for my presentation, actually on Southeast Asia, specifically on the ASEAN organization and the population within it. So in terms of the overview, I'll talk a little bit about the impact of economic integration, which is cementing the neoliberal capitalism, women's labor rights, specifically focusing on domestic work and also export industries, and finally the women land right. Now, as of 31st, well, I suppose January 2016, so 3 months ago, okay, ASEAN became an ASEAN community officially. So what does that mean? Yeah, many documents were signed, as usual. Sound very cynical here. But yeah, so there was this document which is the ASEAN 2025 Forging Ahead. Within it, there were 3 pillars, the blueprints, which were also inside it. And the biggest one, which will actually impact women with regards to our discussion, is actually on the ASEAN economic pillar blueprint, which is within the big document. Now, the others were the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, and then you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Brunei, and 8 others, and of course led by the US, was also signed. And then there came another one, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the 10 ASEAN countries, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So we are working under these 4 these different documents, using them as something to monitor, actually, for the next 5 years or so. And Asia Pacific, APWLD has been very fundamental in finding the sites where we can actually improve on the documents which have been done, because many times things are not being included. And if you don't have it inside, written out, then it is very difficult for us to have conversations, sometimes it's not a conversation, with our different governments, okay, or agencies in the region, in order to ensure that women's rights, economic rights in this case, are taken care of. So, as for the social landscape right now, there are about 625 million in the entire region. And out of this, we have a literacy rate is about 90%, so which is pretty good. But from, let me see, there are other things which should, yeah, net enrollment rate of children in primary school is up to 92%, so which means the level of education is pretty high in the region, okay, which has a strong correlation with health care in the region, and also, yeah, at present there is a proportion of about 40% people living in the urban areas, because all this has implication in terms of work, in terms of transportation, in terms of access. We're talking about substantive equality here, so we're looking at access to education and to health, to economic opportunities. So these are the things that we need to consider, and how all those agreements that our government signed will actually have an impact on the livelihood of the women in the region. And once again, I have to mention that definitely there is a diverse group of women here we're talking about, different ethnicity, different religion, and the 5 older ASEAN country members, are so-called much slightly advanced compared to the new one. And this gap in economic development is also something that can present barriers as well as opportunities. So we need to have that in terms of in our minds when we're dealing with trying to forge forward with whether it's an action plan or whether it is the monitoring plan for all of these different agreements that have been signed. Okay, so towards 2025, this is what the region would like to be. Okay, a rule-based, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN community who will enjoy human rights and fundamental freedoms, higher quality of life, reinforcing our sense of togetherness and common identity. So this is what it is supposed to be by the year 2025. Now, the thing is, what is the process going to be like? And to what extent of inclusion or exclusion that different groups are facing, especially women and girls, because we have many issues that we do have to deal with. In fact, this afternoon I'll talk some more about the issues. But yeah, regional economic policies will actually deepen inequality. The policies of competition, privatization, liberalization, deregulation exacerbate inequalities and are most deeply felt by the poor, by marginalized groups, and as well as by women. So the 3 major areas that APWLD is really looking at will be on decent work and living wage. So there's a big disparity between the two. I'll show you the data after this. Healthcare itself, while some countries may have better facilities, but sometimes the logistics of getting to the healthcare center is something that we really need to work on. Even in Malaysia, in Sabah and Sarawak, the distance is just enormous. Sometimes you need the boats, you need to go hours, or you need to use helicopter, and these are not very safe areas in terms of the weather and so on to get in. So in terms of healthcare for women, it is very problematic to get it sometimes. Accessibility, in the areas. Land and resources. This is another area that APWLD is putting a lot of effort in. Okay, there are 35 countries that we look into the Asia Pacific. So we have members right across about 120 different organizations are members of APWLD. So this is you can just go to our website, and go get it. Okay, what are the discriminatory consequences? Now, if my tongue is a bit slower than my head, you just have to forgive me a little bit, because it is a bit of a jet lag. We just arrived yesterday morning, All right, discriminatory consequences: reduced state revenue, tax reduction, tax competition will shift the burden to consumption taxes. So, which means the end user would have to bear the burden of when they reduce tax for corporates and so on. Yeah, it looks good for the corporation, but then who will be having to bond the burden of this? Diminished potential for public investment and safety nets. This is another consequences of policies when it is a really neoliberal base. Competitive advantage for cheap labor, costs raised to the bottom. Wages as well as conditions, diminishing public sector employment. One of the only secure sources of employment for women, state-owned enterprises chapter in TPP, likely to have large impacts. This is an example in Vietnam on secure employment. So these are the things that we have to bear in mind when we have regional economic policies signed by the leaders of the states that we need to pay attention to. There are many other different things that we need to pay attention when there are when these kind of agreements are being signed. For example, the procurement and public-private partnerships. Under this, development, bidding, and ongoing costs in these public-private projects are likely to be greater than the traditional government procurement processes. So when you have this kind of a situation, chances are those who are bidding for it, there will be exclusion or inclusion depending on what are the criteria that is needed. PPPs by region, so you can look at the different regions. Well, the Asia region right now, the value is about 155 billion actually. I think she forgot to put the value as it is. Now, this is another big thing that we need to look into, the investor-state dispute settlement. Yeah, this is when a company can actually sue the government. Before we did not have this kind of a situation, but if under the TPP, actually this is one of the things which is being put in. So corporations are able to sue government if laws, policies, or decision reduces or may reduce their profit. Okay, so there can be a reduction in the state income. Now, awards has gone as high as 2.4 billion in one of these cases. Yeah? There is a freezing effect on domestic policy making, which can include environmental regulation, wage and law regulations, tax laws, public health and public access decision, as well as affirmative action policies. So the implication is very big. Just that right now the ASEAN, the countries in ASEAN has about, those who sign the TPP will have about 2 years to get it through. So there is a strong lobbying effort going on in different countries to try not to get the parliament to pass it. But chances are, if you have a majority of the same political parties in place, the agreement will pass. Yeah? So, which means that with these different policies, we will really face the effect in about 2 more years. So 27 by 2018. So that is what APWLD is looking at, to see where we might be able to intervene in different ways. Okay. Yeah. From those agreements, also there will be reduced access to medicines, because there has been patent monopolies, expansion of evergreening in terms of companies, and there has been no TRIPS, which is provision for developing countries. So these are different agreements that will also cause problems in terms of the price of medicine, as well as reduce in terms of the numbers, sensibility. Now, that brings me to the second part. How much time does we have?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay, I'll rush through. You got excited sometimes. Okay, labor rights, domestic workers. This is an issue which actually has been discussed a little earlier. But yeah, domestic work is the largest driver of women's migration in the area. 1 in every 13 employed women are actually in the domestic workers. So this table shows the different distribution of domestic workers in the region, as well as the numbers. Yeah, so 83% right there. Domestic workers in Southeast Asia, yeah, and all ASEAN countries employ large numbers of women in domestic work. Now, migrant women represented around 30% of Singapore's total labor force, and more than 20% in Malaysia. Domestic workers' rights are often negotiated bilaterally. So there's, it's a one-to-one agreement. It's not done in a broader manner, because then actually the disadvantage is you will have less negotiating power when it comes to just negotiating with one state. There is not a regional pressure to have trying to get better rights for women workers. So labor codes and domestic workers, so you can see different countries, yeah, whether it's included under national labor legislation, basic rights protected. So yeah, this data is available if you are interested. The rights to organize, so this is something else. Freedom of association and protection of the rights to organize convention. So who has signed, who has not signed? As you can see in my country, we have not signed. And it's going to take a while. You have also other conventions on the rights of migrants, workers. Indonesia just signed, so this is good. that we've got that. Yeah. Now, when it comes to domestic workers, there is the issue of immigration and the debt that workers would have to pay, and the issue of confiscation of passport documentation. These are taking place in the region, you know. So out of a study done, so it's how many respondents mentioned that they have been, you know, you actually do not have the right to take out the passport of a person, but employer do this. So in different countries. And then recruitment debt, this is another thing that has to be borne by the workers. Yeah? So whether the debt is with agency or debt paid in full before migration, so this occurred as well. Yeah? Minimum wage compared to the living wage. So this is something you can look at also. So if you see for Asia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia and Malaysia, even if you look at Malaysia, it's almost double what is being paid. Even though we just have, the government just increased the minimum wage to about 900 ringgit. 900 ringgit is about, how many pounds? Cannot convert right now. But anyway, it's in euro, right? Okay, so in 196 euro. So that is, but the real living wage is actually about 361 euro in order to live decently well. And a lot of the workers actually send the money back home. This is what is going on. So where land is concerned, yes, 45% of economically active women are engaged in agriculture. So this is a big issue that we need to look at. Yeah? Whether you own the land or whether you have access to the land, that is more the question. In many countries, okay, we have people owning the land, but there are still customary laws that we have to deal with, which says that this is a common area. So land grabbing does occur, small-scale agriculture is not well supported, and women trade push out of agro business as well as due to the trade rules. And finally, the issue of privatizing water. Now, water is very essential to all of us, but we are seeing a lot of companies and so on, governments trying to privatize water. So this is a big issue. More than 180 cities in municipalities in 35 countries throughout Asia Pacific had to end with this private-public partnership in water. So there are cases right here. Indonesia court ordered an end to Jakarta contract, yeah, because there was a fourfold increase in the cost of water, the price. And you know, this is not accessible, or so people have to resort to unclean water. You still have to find something. So these are the things which people are facing. So I know my time has ended. I will not make a conclusion because we are going into a discussion after this. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rashida. Absolutely, the discussion is ongoing. And what you've done, you've sort of taken us beyond the country context of Malaysia to regional association. And what you've made us look at is ASEAN and likewise organization in terms of resources. When we look at women's empowerment and possibility and necessary action plan, opportunities offered by ASEAN, etc. But also the challenges and difficulties, and the way you sum it by drawing out some real issues that women face across different statuses and occupations. And that seems to me also quite important here to be doing. And what that also brings out the critical issue of advocacy, of women organizing, and the need for us to consider tomorrow in the course of our conversation also of not only what needs to do, what's already in place. I think that's quite important. And you brought the example of APWMD and the important work, advocacy work doing there, and as well as what is missing. So that really has to be, it raises a great many other issues, because my interest in Islam, in religion, in impact and so on, raises a number of additional issues here in terms of what is available to resources, and women's access to resources of those who are members of the faith, who have very different notions of progress, development. This forum is very much about bringing leaders, voices from different spheres of society together, and we are now inviting our third speaker, Georgia Hanyas. Georgia, head of global communications at Innovate Finance. Okay, I now depend on the very helpful notes I've been given. A membership association for fintech based in level 39, Europe's largest accelerator space for fintech innovation. I'm learning. You're also the diversity lead for the organization, interest promoting financial inclusion, attracting more women in banking and fintech profession. Previously director within Citygate, do Robertson corporate practice, heading up the agency startup division, supporting range of established tech clients with extraordinary experience in terms of previous consultancies, representations, running agencies, spanning consumer, third sector, technology companies, but also media, running several news programs, so extraordinary multinational experience in both traditional and digital PR campaigns, working hugely sort of across many different sectors and occupations. Very, very impressive CV here. And I think what you're bringing now into this conversation, another kind of challenge, that is the opportunities offered finance technology and how within the Southeast Asia context, what kind of pathways might there be open to access it? Georgia, if I can invite you to the microphone, eagerly to learn from you. So. I'm, hang on, needing to get out of this here. I feel slightly challenged at the moment.
Actually, we can use the minimum wage up there.
Yeah,
it's actually telling it. It's
useful.
Okay. I think it's quite useful, actually.
Yes,
what we're going to
please,
discuss.
absolutely. If you don't mind.
Yes, fine. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that extraordinary introduction. I'm not half as impressive as you need to be. As Maria said, I'm head of global communications